Sure, sure. So with that, I want to invite Natalie or Eric to share their slides, whoever's going to drive. And I'd like to introduce Natalie Meyers, who's the interim head of the Navari Family Center for Digital Scholarship and a research librarian at Notre Dame. She's in the Digital Initiatives and Scholarships group, where she helps pioneer and provide research data consulting services, including more in-depth data management services in support of grant-funded research. And Eric Morgan is the Digital Initiatives Librarian in the Center for Digital Scholarship. His current work focuses on assisting faculty and students with text mining and analysis. Though his work involves extensive computing expertise, Eric considers himself to be a librarian first and a computer user second. Thank you so much for joining us, and I'll turn it over to you, Natalie.
Thank you so much, Christine. I hope you can hear me okay?
Can hear you great.
Perfect. Thank you to everyone for joining me. I want to talk to you a little bit about what a pleasure it's been to use Eric's tool, the Distant Reader, for getting quick insights into the heterogeneous data sets that we've been talking about, plus one more example of distant reading for quick insight from simple surveys. When we think about text mining, we often think at the 30,000-foot view. I'm going to take us down in the weeds and back up again. All the text mining that I show you for this project was performed using Eric's tool, Distant Reader, which you can visit at distantreader.org. And I'll show a couple other examples at the end that will tie back into some of the content that we've seen from Peter, Ilya, and Iris. So I really appreciate the opportunity that they've given me to be able to skip describing the COVID-19 data set. What I'd like you to think about is text mining to explore simple survey responses first. So in other words, if we had just one question on a survey and we wanted to use text mining to explore the world that question exposed us to, if we looked at the United States academic library response to COVID-19, one of the things that happened was that libraries had to determine when it was no longer safe to stay open and when they needed to close and no longer allow physical access to patrons. In the academic library context, that was a decision often tied to when campuses decided whether it was safe for students to be any longer on campus. A survey was circulated at that time, and it is still live on the internet. It was conducted by Lisa and Christine, whose names you can see here on the slide. And their question 17 was, if available, respondents, please provide us the information for library users on library policies and procedures in light of COVID. And in that question, respondent libraries would enter the URL for the website that their campus was sharing with students to alert them of why their library was closed. So we used the Distant Reader to mine the survey data, to harvest the content at the end of those URLs, to get a look at what libraries were saying, not just what they were doing related to closure. And our main question was, why don't most library websites come right out and say it? What we noticed was a trend among respondents on their websites, in contradiction to what they said in the survey, to avoid saying we are closed. The phrase "we are closed" only showed up on 3 of the websites that we harvested content from. And we think we know why. We think it's because the real or the big message those libraries were trying to communicate was that their services were still available online. So using the Distant Reader, we were able to mine the content from these URLs and give ourselves a better picture of what academic libraries were communicating to their patrons during this time. some of the questions that simple exercise leads us to consider are that open data doesn't always mean fair data. That's okay, but one of the things that we encountered was, even though the data was open, again, it was interoperating against Qualtrics, we had to manually download the data. We had to manually pre-process it. We were able to use some automated tools to do that, but it was still a manually pre-processed step. We had about an 86% web crawling success rate against those library URLs. From them, we received the content that you saw mined in the previous slide. We had some difficulties with capturing organization names. We'll get back to that in a second, related to the graph databases you've seen already. We could have retrieved those from the survey data because the survey asked respondents to include their iPad's name and their iPad's number. However, those were difficult to retrieve and not always published alongside the URL responses. So it was a little awkward, either as a human or a machine, to access all the content we needed in one place. Then we found some difficulties with named entity recognition and tuning that against the sort of things that people use on their databases. So what we found is that because of the way that the survey respondents constructed their websites, and because of the way they answered the surveys, not all URLs were crawlable. Not all URL content was harvestable. We ran into some headless browser problems, but 86% of success in harvesting content was better than we expected. So what did we learn from that about text mining and FAIRifying? We learned that FAIRification of our gateway's output was a priority, but we needed to decide what to do first. We store output from the text mining conducted in the distant reader gateway in downloadable zip containers that we call study carrels. We decided we needed to implement better credit for carrel creators. We needed to better leverage ORCIDs for carrel creators and present resolvable PIDs for all our carrels and offer DOIs for all our public carrels. If we would do those things, we come part of the way toward making more fair gateway outputs, and that's something that we're keen to do soon. We also found that we need to think about, when consuming open data, ways that we can create resolvable credit for our carrel or downloadable content, ways that we can do license checking against that content and make it visible to users of our downloadable data files, and that if we can get some more fair metadata embedded in our text mining outputs, we could have an informative API for interacting with our downloadable content. And we could also represent those carrels instead of just in a relational database in the download and an HTML representation of that content in a RDF or other graph format as well that would exploit the fairness of the resource. Now, if you'll bear with me, we'll talk a little bit about using the same tool, Distant Reader, to text mine the Cord19 data set. Iris has saved me from having to tell you a lot about the data set, so I'll move on. I just want to emphasize that just as Iris, Peter, and Ilya described, ours are not the only text mining projects against the Cord19 data set. The approaches and insights to that data set are quite numerous, in part because it is included in the Open Research Dataset Challenge on Kaggle. in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, when the Allen Institute for AI partnered with leading research groups to prepare and distribute the COVID-19 data set, one of the things they did was stand up a competition against several questions related to the data set. And we'll look at that a little bit more in a moment too. When we ran the distant reader against the COVID-19 data set, we encountered some issues. One of those was related to scale versus portability and the way our gateway attacked a data set with so many items. Another issue we ran into was optimizing our gateway to efficiently consume the new versions of the corpus. When we first text mined the COVID-19 data set in March 17th, there were only 13,000 full text papers. You saw in Ilya and Peter's description how quickly that data set has grown and expanded. We also found that we needed to modularize the way our gateway does text processing to include SciSpacey and other text processors that users can choose between so that they can optimize the way their content is processed by our gateway. Our gateway was not developed with scientific papers in mind, but general literature, including fiction. So in order to process scientific literature appropriately, we need to modularize which text processors our users select between in order so that the content we output is the most reuseful for them in the future. We looked at some of the strengths and use cases for distant reading. And one of the things we found was that we need to do better named entity recognition and treatment of proper nouns in order to get good quality reusable output from our text mining gateway. And another shortcoming we found is that we were not resolving n-grams very efficiently back to text strings in context. In other words, we're showing our end users a lot of terrific insights into their data, but we're not necessarily giving them a streamlined way to get back to that resource in context and understand its importance and why it rose to the top and what they could view. Let's talk a tiny bit more about performance versus portability. We looked at the distant reader against the single survey question. Now we're looking at it against a data set, in our case, 13,000 full text items in the March 17th core data set release. And when we ran it again against the 40,000 article data set, we encountered some performance issues. That's because our distant reader gateway works like a traditional HPC. You bring your input data up to the processor, submit your job, wait for your output. And what we found was that it was taking too long for our output to write because of the non-parallel nature of our reduction step. That exposed a tension between two competing priorities of the distant reader. One of those was that our users could download the results of their searches as SQLite downloadable databases. And what we found was that we need to move to Postgres or another database that will allow more efficient parallel processing. And it had exposed for us a tension in the distant reader between what we thought was incredibly important for it to produce a downloadable platform independent data set or study carrel that end users could access in a way that was independent of our gateway after their processing was complete. That was a dearly held assumption of ours, and we're having to rethink the way to prioritize both the performance of the gateway and the utility of the download package that we return to the user. Finally, just want to mention that data sets may be open but not verified. We encountered similar problems with the core data set as with the library survey, but they were amplified at scale. And that other approaches, like we see on Kaggle, can take a question and answer approach to the problems and use NLP to tackle those, or a network-based approach where the data set intersects the graph in order to encourage collaborations and making fair connections. With that, I'll close, and I hope we have time for a question or two. Thank you, Christine.
Oh, sure. Thank you so much. Let me pull up one last slide, mine, that I'd like to share with everyone, and then we will take questions. So before we lose people at the top of the hour, I'd like to remind you that the Go Fair initiative, of which we host the Go Fair US office, is still taking participants for the virus outbreak data network. And if you'd like to join, here's a link. These slides are also going to be posted on our website, which was listed on this last slide here. And, oops. tinyurl.com/RDS-GoFair. Please remember to look for the VODAN Africa series, which will start in 2 weeks. It will be on Thursdays at the same time. And those of you who registered for this, I'll send you one email to let you know about it. I also want to highlight from last week, UCSF's what they call the database of databases that Ilya showed at the top of his talk. That's at spoke.ucsf.edu. And every week we have what we call Meredith's Corner. She's our executive director from the West Big Data Hub. This week I put a call out to all of the big data hubs in the US and asked them if there's one resource that you would mention related to COVID-19 and data, what would it be? I forgot to let them know it was for this webinar, and they said you should tune in to the Go Fair US VODAN webinar. But they also highlighted the COVID-19 data lake put out by this, I think it's called the C3 AI Institute, and that's at c3.ai/COVID. And if you register there, starting today, they're sending out access to their data lake so that at least you don't have to duplicate all of the steps to gather all of this data together. So with that, I'd like to open it up to questions. I want to thank all of our speakers. I mean, as you saw from Iris's slide that showed, in order to try and get your arms around everything out there related to COVID-19 data, that you'd have to know a bit about virology, a bit about genetics, immunology, intensive care medicine, and molecular biology. And that was just in one subdomain. Wow. Today we had e-research librarians, data scientists, experts in bioinformatics and geospatial data. And so if nothing else, I hope you can see that the approach that's needed to fight COVID-19, especially from a data perspective, is really going to take a transdisciplinary approach. It's not just your normal data problem where you can list things in an Excel spreadsheet and get a nice sum at the end. It takes a lot more to gain insight from this data, not just because of its the largesse of how much there is, as well as things are recorded in different ways, and so you have to know how to translate between them. You have to know how to make connections between the data, and relationships are very key with this kind of research, and that's why we highlighted a few projects with knowledge graphs. So please, if you have a question, unmute yourself and ask away. We have all of the speakers still on.
So this is Peter. I have a question for Iris. You mentioned name entity recognition. Can you tell us a little bit about what types of named entity you recognize? You know, since it's about biomedical text, do you find biomedical entities, for example?
Hey, hello, Peter. Yes, we actually read through all the titles and abstract as of now, and we are planning to include the full text from the PMC and all the Core 19 share the full text. We will we will read through those and recognizing what concept are talking about, right? Because we already integrate our 700K concept from Wikipedia, from the UMLS, the medical vocabulary organized by the NIH. But that's we think that may not be enough, because they are keep on having the new concept or new things are coming up from the latest literature. So we are still using the NER approach to go through all the latest titles, abstract, and the full text to discover new things. As you see that in my earlier slides, as of now, up until maybe 80 to 90% are still the external curated concept, but about 5 to 10% of the new concept are coming from the NER technology. We recognize them while we are reading the new publications. Is that answering your question, or you are more interested in the detailed technology we are using?
No, I was more interested, you know, do you find, you know, specific protein names or gene names, things of that nature? I mean, I understand about concepts, but more specifically about biomedical entities like protein identifiers and so forth.
Yes, we are because from say the external library, we may only get the limited number of those, and also a limited name for those, and we can scan through the academic literature to detect more synonyms of those. So basically two types, right? One is synonyms, new synonyms for the existing concept, as well as a new concept.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Last call for questions. I'm mindful that we're a few minutes past the top of the hour, and I know people probably have several hours of Zoom left to go in the United States, and those of you in Europe and Africa, it is dinner time for you. So last call for questions, and then we will close the call.
Great presentations. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Nice to hear your voice. Well, with that, let's go ahead and close the call. You have our website where we will have this presentation recording as well as the slides. And please get in touch with us if you have interest in other things that haven't been highlighted, or you know about other resources that should be brought to bear for this problem that concerns us all. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kristen.
Thank you.
Yeah.